we have the honor of our first speaker, Michael Studivan from CMUS, who's going to talk about corals from urbanized habitats in Southeast Florida. Go for it.
Thank you very much. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. My name is Michael Studivan. I am an associate scientist with CMUS and AOML across the street. I see our mouse is right there in the middle. I'm excited to kick us off today because this is a very local story and something that is very near and dear to my heart. Of course, this is not going to work. That would be, there we go. It's all right. I can use the keyboard. I'm, of course, talking about the Port of Miami. It's my favorite dive site here in Miami. And I don't think I need to remind anyone that the Port of Miami is extremely urbanized. So for the last 100 years, we've gone from a primarily natural coastline that's sandy bottom with offshore reefs into this highly artificial managed waterway. So we have artificial structures that stabilize the shoreline. We have boulders, seawalls, houses right on the water. And very managed water flow throughout the region, coming from the Miami River, coming from all the impervious surfaces in the port. There's heavy commercial industrial traffic, there's cruise terminals, there's lots of recreational boating. This is truly a bustling area. Now, despite this highly dynamic environment, we've started to find corals here. So for the last 30 or so years, corals have started to settle inside the Port of Miami in areas where we don't necessarily think that corals should be able to survive. Now, these corals are really special, not just because they're living in proverbial and literal garbage, but because they're truly thriving despite these overwhelming odds. And so our group is setting out to try and figure out why these corals are here and what makes them so special, how they're able to survive. And our first step was to characterize these environments. And I need to say that these are not reef environments. These corals are not accreting calcium carbonate in the same way that a reef coral is. It's not creating this overall habitat. These are corals that are settling on existing hard bottom habitat and are just growing really well. So it's not a flat pavement like we have just off of Key Biscayne here at Emerald Reef, which is mostly flat, calcium carbonate substrate, and corals growing on there as they have for tens of thousands of years. Instead, in the Port of Miami, we have these highly linear substrates. At MacArthur Causeway North, on the highway out to South Beach, we have these large granite boulders that have been put along the highway for shoreline stabilization. Corals are growing directly on this granite. At Star Island, we have these vertical seawalls that are primarily made out of concrete, also sometimes made out of steel. Corals are growing completely vertical. And we can see in this inset to the bottom left, these corals get so large to the point where they actually fall off of their substrates because they're entirely too heavy. So this is just a completely unique environment that you wouldn't think that corals are able to grow just face up on a completely flat surface like this, but indeed they are. Now, when we look at the overall reef communities here, we see a very stark picture comparing it to the natural reefs off of Miami. Emerald Reef, for example, has under 1% coral cover, almost non-existent. And events like stony coral tissue loss disease, the Port of Miami dredging, have continued to decrease the number of corals that we have on these reefs. Inside the port, it's a different story, where we have between 2 and 6% of coral cover. And you might chuckle and say that's really nothing, but considering that the majority of the Florida Keys has anywhere between 2 to 5% coral cover, this is pretty good. And a lot of the species that we find inside the port are species that are almost non-existent on the reefs because of stony coral tissue loss disease. A lot of these species are highly and moderately susceptible to this disease, and yet they're still thriving inside the port. Now, the conditions inside the port are also hyper-variable. In terms of temperature, the corals inside the port are experiencing lower lows and higher highs. This week, these corals are probably pretty frigid right now, yet they don't succumb to cold stress. In the summer, these corals are experiencing temperatures up to about 34 degrees Celsius, which is 4 degrees higher than the established coral bleaching threshold, where they lose their algal symbionts and eventually starve to death. These corals are they bleach every year, then they recover, and they're fine. Along with temperature swings, we also have huge swings in pH, often on a daily basis due to tidal flushing. You can see in this graph that our colors corresponding to our urban sites, the darker blues kind of cover everything. You can't even really see the ranges that are happening out on the reef, and that's because these corals are experiencing really high pH, but also really low pH, to the point where it's almost a simulation of end-of-century climate change predictions, where these corals are actively experiencing ocean acidification. We also have huge swings in PAR. A lot of times these corals are literally baked because they're between the surface and, say, 5 feet of depth, so they're getting a ton of available light for photosynthesis, but they're also getting a lot of UV radiation. And then on the other end of the spectrum, these corals can be in almost blackout conditions because there's a lot of sedimentation and turbidity because of all the freshwater inputs into the system. Related to that, salinity also swings wildly. Because it's so close to the Miami River and so close to a lot of impervious surfaces, these corals are experiencing huge ranges of salinities, and it frankly doesn't seem to bother them. So how are they able to survive? So one of the tools that we've used to better understand their physiological state despite these environmental swings is by using transcriptomics, which is like a snapshot into the coral's gene expression at the time of sampling. This allows us to look at what kind of stimuli that they're responding to and how they're responding at a cellular level. And we found when we compared urban corals to reef corals is that urban corals are upregulating genes related to particle recognition, immune responses, and digestive and degrading enzymes. This is telling us that these corals are always kind of primed and ready to not only eat if there's a food source or ward off pathogens. They're able to recognize those pathogens faster than the reef corals. Now, we've also corroborated this with stable isotope analyses, finding that our urban corals are better able to switch from autotrophy, being primarily photosynthetic, to a mixed heterotrophic, where they're eating particles that are entering in the waterways. These corals also have a very stark change in algal symbiont communities. Out on the reef, they're dominated by the genus Breviolum. It's a dinoflagellate that's pretty widely spread across the Caribbean. Inside the port, we see an almost exclusive shift to Durastinium. This is a known thermal-tolerant genus that probably allows these corals to better persist under thermal stress events in the summer. So you might be asking yourself right now, if they're already experiencing end-of-century conditions, will they be able to survive climate change? And so that's kind of the million-dollar question here. And so using the experimental reef lab that's in MTLSS just across the way here, we can exactly simulate what these corals could be experiencing at the end of the century. So we exposed them to a combination of ocean acidification and thermal stress and looked at their physiological responses as well as their overall survival. And so these two figures are survivorship graphs, where on our x-axis we have the number of days under treatment, our y-axis is the probability of survivorship, and then we have our two species, Orbicella fabulata and Siderastria siderea. And you can see our urban sites shown in browns, they survive longer. Those curves are higher than our reef sites in green. These corals are better able to persist under stress. So this story has been primarily about the Port of Miami, but these corals, these types of urban corals, exist in other areas in Southeast Florida, namely in Port Everglades, in Broward County, and Port of Palm Beach in Palm Beach County. And so over the last 4 years now, we've collected these 5 species as highly disease-susceptible species and dominant reef builders across the 3 Southeast Florida counties, over 900 coral samples that we're working out for population genetics so we can understand not only where these populations came from initially, but now whether they're able to contribute to the persistence of reef populations by exporting larvae out onto the reefs. We are also trying to determine actively whether these corals are contributing to population persistence at this minute. So we're using a combination of different approaches. We're doing in situ spawning observations using divers as well as time-lapse cameras. We have ex situ spawning that we're attempting at the hatchery across the street. And what I'm really excited to share is that when we sample these corals before and after spawning, we see evidence that they are not only producing gametes, but they're also releasing those gametes. So using tissue histology, we can determine that not only are eggs there, as you can see those round-ish structures in the top panels, when we sample that same coral after spawning, those eggs are gone. And they're not being digested, they're being released. So these corals are actively spawning. So can we use these in our restoration pipelines? I'd like to say yes. We are currently working with a bunch of different restoration partners here and elsewhere in the state to propagate these corals. And so if you remember 3 things from this talk, it's first, that corals are persisting despite overwhelming odds in these urbanized environments in Florida. Second, these corals are likely more capable of dealing with climate change than typical corals we find out on the reefs. And then finally, these populations may preserve critical genetic diversity that has otherwise been extinguished in places like Miami and elsewhere on Florida's coral reef. I invite you to learn more about the work that we are doing at this link below. Also check out the Coral City camera. It's a live streaming camera in the Port of Miami. You can see lots of cool stuff, including myself on a good weather day. Thank you, everyone.